The wanderer stood atop the crumbling cliff, eyeing the shadowy landscape below. The tall grass quaked at his feet, every blade shivering away from the soles of his worn rubber boots. The wind was fierce at such a height. The pinnacle of tortured moans tossed his clumped hair and whipped at his apron. The chainsaw felt heavy in his hand, his fingers frozen around the grip in a painful inability to let go. Occasionally, he squeezed them around the deteriorated foam handle, feeling every digit pop in its restless embrace. He could feel the aura of power calling to him, an intoxicating tether reeling him to the next worthy soul that could feed the teeth of his saw. Far below the rocky cliff was a rundown house, one that was built along the edge of a quarry. It looked like it was barely standing near the edge, ready to cave at any second. The sinister presence seemed to radiate deep within the walls of the shoddy structure. The chainsaw man felt the overwhelming sensation of bloodlust boiling in his fuel-festering veins, a feeling that the tall grass seemed to respond to. The blades flattened against the ground and shook in fear as the boiling rose throughout the wanderer, a feeling the masked man himself had no trouble keeping under control. The mask on his face shook, vibrating so fast the outer rim was a blur. The man squeezed his fist and forced the adrenaline to subside, promising that soon it would be able to take the reins and swing the saw to its heart's content. Inside the beaten home was an enemy much stronger than the previous, one so strong he could feel its aura bleed out through the siding. The wanderer took a step forward and free fell, letting his arms out to embrace the cool wind. The sudden rush of air whipped his wild hair as he watched himself plummet, feeling nothing but the thrill of the impending massacre. Even as he fell, he held his gaze to the house, feeling the demonic aura like an echoing heartbeat. It called to him, a song of anguish luring him in with a gentle, caressing hand. The ground rapidly approached, and the air whistled in the wanderer's ears, holding his lusting stare as he positioned himself at the last second, his boots meeting the earth so hard the ground shook in protest. The bones in his legs shifted, a temporary inconvenience that would sort itself out before he even made it to the front porch of the gloomy destination. There was a sort of gravel driveway leading to the building, thousands of human teeth crunching under his boots, where gravel would be appropriate. There were no roads connecting to the driveway, only the rocky wall in which the wanderer had just descended. It was almost like it was paved there just for him. The crackling mixture of molars and canines shifted under the weight of each step. The grinding sound was pleasant to him. It would have taken hundreds of victims to make such a thing, and the power of the individual responsible would be something worth seeing. The wind sang across the valley, wind that seemed to come from the direction of the rundown house. The wanderer marched up the drive, the crunching teeth getting louder the closer he got to the porch. There were glinting beads watching him from under the steps, two little glassy eyes shining in the darkness behind the steps. The wanderer continued his pace and watched the eyes without the faintest feeling of interest. Each step closer showed more of its appearance, cheeks and ears becoming visible until the entire face revealed itself. It was the head of a child, only a few years old. It looked to be floating in place, holding itself up with thin jellyfish-like tentacles. Its mouth was open blankly, and its eyes tracked the wanderer as he drew close. He stopped and watched the face silently, feeling a trickle of power seep from under the shadows of the porch. The floating head looked like it wanted to say something, but the only sound to escape its lips was a repetitive gasp. Other orbs began to materialize around the child's head. Little specks of pink neon blinking to life in sets. 2, then 4, a dozen, 2 dozen. The sense of power grew as the orbs surrounded the floating head. And then in an instant, the head was gone. Hundreds of pointing teeth snapped down and devoured it, suddenly turning it into digestible pieces. The many eyes drew closer, followed by the skittering body of an oily spider abomination. It had too many legs to count, and they twitched in all directions, each appendage barbed like a scorpion's stinger. It hissed defiantly, as if to warn the wanderer to back off. The wanderer simply stared at the arachnid hybrid, even as it revealed 2 crab-like pincers dripping with poison. The rusted iron mask strapped to the wanderer's face just looked at it unamused, its closed eyes and a motionless visor offering nothing at its aggression. The chainsaw remained limp at his side. The spider hissed once more and retreated to an unseen hiding spot under the house. The wanderer said nothing and climbed the steps, each board aching under his weight as he worked his way to the front door. All the windows were boarded up, and there was no way to see inside. The wanderer tried the knob and was surprised to find it unlocked. Inside, the house was derelict. A thick haze of dust wafted through the abode like a cloud, the heavy particles catching cracks of light through the slits in the windows. It looked abandoned, plain living room furniture staged and unused like a forgotten movie set. Old rags and illegible newspapers littered the floor, along with random discarded trash. The garbage itself didn't make any sense, like it was someone's inclination of what garbage should look like. At first glance, it looked like nobody was home. The wanderer took a step in and panned his head across the room. His body was stiff, in need of a kill, and the effort it would require from his body. Stagnant veins begged for stimulation, and the rusted blade felt empty in his hand. He moved through the house autonomously, determined to find the reason he was drawn here. There would be sufficient sustenance here. He wouldn't settle for otherwise. In the living room, there was nothing. When the empty kitchen failed him as well, he took down the hall to the bedroom, which produced only a heavily stained mattress and more boarded windows. The wanderer looked around slowly, trying to pinpoint the heart of what had called him there. Outside, the wind assaulted the house, whistling cool air fighting its way through the siding to produce a draft. The air howled its tortured groan, the same tune the wanderer had heard hundreds of times on his possessed search for challenge. But still, he craned his head. There was something off about this particular tune, an additional pain that sounded too close to him to be a part of the chorus. It was a moan, a tired bleating of weakness, and it was close. The wanderer looked at the floorboards beneath his feet and tightened his grip on the chainsaw. Below, the hunchback waddled leisurely amongst the chain stock. A single light bulb hung from above, swaying in the draft from the wind outside. Men and women of every age surrounded him in the dingy basement. Those who couldn't hide in the dark simply covered their faces and whimpered. With their hope long lost, their only choice was to huddle obediently on the filthy concrete. Most were beaten and starved, stripped of their clothing and forced to wait in the perpetual line that led to the large wooden door. It was locked at all times and only opened when the master required it to. The hunchback, his shrunken and malformed body garbed in a cloak stitched from the skin of many who had been processed, narrowed his eyes on a young woman. She was shivering and hugging herself, looking up at him with a single good eye, the other heavily bruised and swollen. He lurched toward her like a goblin, every 2 steps followed by a slap to the floor to keep from falling over. His other hand held dearly a key around his neck, one made of shiny brass. The young woman wanted to turn away, but was too weak to do so, only capable of helplessly watching as he shuffled over to her. The hunchback caressed her thigh with a bony finger, running the digit along the outline of ribs and the flutter of her stomach as she whimpered. He dug into his cloak with a giggle and produced a sharp, bony knife, one that he used to gently carve into the flesh of her abdomen. Her pain was hushed and disassociated, but he still found pleasure in it. The way her flesh cut easily, tender and lean. She would be a perfect next choice. Above, the ceiling exploded, followed by the heavy impact of a large, broad form. The hunchback wiped debris and dust from his face, in time to see the solid bulk of the wanderer crouched before him. From behind a false metal face, the intruder was looking silently at the ground, where his knee had completely obliterated the young girl's face, her head along with it. He was already climbing to his feet, leaning on the blade of a rusted chainsaw to help himself up. His joints cracked as he stood tall, and the other cattle shrugged away from him, clawing and thrashing at each other to hide in the dark. Flustered and angry, the hunchback shouted at him, incoherent syllables meant for an insult, falling on deaf ears. The wanderer shrugged him off and looked at the large wooden door. The master's room. There was no way he'd be allowed such entry. It was forbidden. With a scowl, the hunchback threw the bony knife at him to get his attention. The handle bounced off the wanderer's face mask harmlessly and disappeared into the darkness of the damp dungeon. The wanderer stopped and looked at the hunchback, his rusted face of closed eyes and mouth staring blankly in annoyance. He could hear the intruder squeezing the handle of the chainsaw, the twist of leather in his elbow-length gloves. The hunchback teased and dangled the key out to him, the only means of opening the door to the master's room. Its polished brass finish shined in the overhead light, catching the wanderer's attention. The chainsaw-wielding man looked from the large wooden door to the key and reached out to take it. In a swift movement, the hunchback laughed and tore the key from his neck, promptly swallowing it. The wanderer watched the cold iron work down the hunchback's wrinkly neck, already working its way to his stomach. The wanderer watched him for a moment before looking at the door again. The sounds of wet chopping echoed off the walls as the butcher cleaved the arm from its shoulder. Heavy, precise swings made a quick work of it, and soon the limb came free in a gush of blood. Spatter drizzled down the butcher's face, the burlap sack sewn permanently as a second skin with crudely cut eye holes. The man the arm belonged to, long dead and decayed, stared up at him with lifeless eyes. He returned the stare from the darkness of his mask, obscured eyes portraying no emotion for the massacring that had taken place. The butcher buried his cleaver in the corpse's forehead and let its dead weight hit the table and tossed the severed arm into a bucket. The room was dim, the scattered beams of gray light from the gloomy sky outside shining in through a single egress window. The light was enough to illuminate his workspace, the same dull glow painting the importances of the room. The wooden table and chopping block, the wall of hung butcher's cleavers and knives, the many meat hooks dangling from above on their grimy chains. There wasn't a single inch of the room not covered in arterial spray. The room looked more like a hollowed-out cave than a workshop. The butcher rolled his shoulder, stretching stiff and rippling muscle that pulsed against the straps of his apron. Now that it was cleared of limbs, he grabbed the torso and held it up to the many jingling chains hanging above. Links and hooks sticky with blood and gore, all stemming from a grand spiderweb of them several feet above. With practiced delicacy, he pierced the torso and let it hang, and taking pride as it joined the sway of the dozens before it. He admired his work, each victim dismembered uniquely to be on display with their special hook. On the other side of the door, the butcher heard a ruckus. One of the cattle must have gotten out of line. He paid it no mind, pulling the cleaver free from the freshly hanging torso and returning it to the wall. He looked over the blades, each dull and caked in blood, but still worthy enough of use. Behind him, something slammed against the large wooden door. The force was enough to rattle the hinges and kicking up the dust in the dimly lit room. A cry from the hunchback rang loud, a sound the most curious in the redundant routine he was accustomed to. He felt his blood boil at the disturbance, unseen eyes immediately searching for the right tool to deliver punishment. He scoured the wall of cleavers, and taking note of the different shapes of blades and the types of cuts they would provide. Something slammed the door again, harder this time. The hunchback was silent, something unusual for the pesky beast. The butcher looked up at the door expectantly, his large hands cracking knuckles as they curled into fists. He hadn't had a visitor in quite some time. The butcher watched as the door exploded, splintering chunks of wood breaking away from the hinges like a bomb had detonated. The deadbolt tore a portion of the wall with it, clearly unable to contain what wanted in. The butcher watched the doorway, wondering what was causing such noise. The heavy-set visitor stepped in, and the butcher noticed two things immediately: the rusted chainsaw held at one side, the bleeding remnants of the hunchback in the other. Holding him by his caved skull, the visitor tossed the body of the hunchback back at the butcher's feet before looking up expectantly through a metal mask. The wanderer had found his adversary. He was bigger than he expected, nearly 7 feet of muscle, held back by an apron quite like his own, his face hidden by a burlap sack. His legs were the size of telephone poles, the stretch of canvas pants barely containing his bulk. The wanderer looked upon the giant of a man and readied the chainsaw in both hands. Behind him, the many prisoners fought to escape from the hole in the ceiling, frantically climbing over each other in hopes for a better life. The butcher looked at the body of the hunchback, his face caved to a pulp like a broken pumpkin. His only form of mourning was a labored exhale, before immediately turning to the wall of cleavers to his right. He reached up with both colossal arms and selected a cleaver from the very top, one with a foot-wide blade and a handle to accommodate its size. The butcher returned with his weapon of choice, brandishing it with a flex of his forearms. The pull of a ripcord, the scream of the saw, the Wanderer's blade roared to life. The thick black smoke erupting from the machine as he bellowed a battle cry. With abnormal speed, he crossed the room with a leap, swinging down vertically with his weight behind it. The butcher raised the cleaver in defense, a flurry of sparks grinding off his blade as the teeth bit angrily. He held the cleaver firm, pushing against the momentum of the Wanderer as he bounced back from his assault. Veins ran taut in his arms as he steadied the cleaver, face to face with the metal mass that invaded his home. Muscles flexed and he thwarted his strike, and the Wanderer immediately came down with another. As the chainsaw's blade blurred inches from his burlap sack, the butcher sidestepped and grabbed the Wanderer by the back of the neck and slammed him into the table. The surface erupted into broken lumber as the Wanderer crashed into the floor, the impact jarring his limbs as he was met with solid concrete. Before he could toss the rubble off of him, the Wanderer looked to see the heavy weight of the butcher's boot immediately following his head. He rolled to the side, barely missing the stomp, and a spiderweb of cracks formed where his skull had been. The Wanderer slashed upward with the chainsaw as he climbed to his feet, knocking the cleaver away before coming down once more. The butcher was surprisingly fast for his size, bobbing and weaving away from the screaming blade before retaliating with his own. Sparks flew, and every clash lit up the room, and the scent of the black smoke mixed with the rot and decay in the room. The Wanderer swung wildly, a maniacal cry growing behind the mask with every deflected strike. In between slashes, the Wanderer connected a solid backhand, one the butcher shrugged off like it was nothing. He raised the large cleaver and brought it down harder, forcing the Wanderer to take a knee and brace against it. Even as the Wanderer folded under the strength of the butcher, he relished in the sickly sweet taste of power he held, one that seemed to grow the longer the fight went on. It radiated off of him like a bloody fog. The Wanderer braced for the next slash, only to feel the unexpected grasp of the butcher grabbing him by the throat. The headbutt he received was hard enough to shake the house. The Wanderer felt the metal mass crunch everything behind it, shattering his nose and blacking both eyes. Before he could recover, the uppercut that followed hit harder, sending him sprawling across the floor like he had been hit by a truck. He rolled to a stop next to the deceased hunchback, still clenching the rumbling saw. Blood pooled from behind the mask, trickling onto the concrete as he picked himself up off the ground. The Wanderer's rusted false face started to vibrate intensely, the edges of metal falling out of focus as it shook. He looked to see the butcher momentarily flex to taunt him, massive shoulders popping as he squeezed the cleaver's handle. He rushed in again, leaping across the room with the crude blade held high. He brought it down with a shout, watching the blade separate flesh and guts in a powerful sweep. The damage was overwhelming, so distractingly so, the butcher didn't realize he had cleaved the body of the hunchback down the middle. Lurching through the entrails of the human shield, the Wanderer wrapped his arms around the waist of the butcher and suplexed him with inhuman speed. The concrete floor burst under the combined weight, the shoulders and head of the butcher smashing chunks into powder as his neck broke sideways. As the butcher thrashed weakly, the Wanderer elbowed him in the temple, sending him sprawling awkwardly. The Wanderer grunted and snaked his arms around his legs and twisted his body, pulling his heavy opponent into a spinning lift. The butcher clawed through the rubble as he was swung into motion, whipping through the air like a pendulum. After 3 rotations of momentum, the Wanderer let him fly, and the butcher catapulted into the wall of cleavers like a missile. Bones and concrete alike shattered as his body caved in the wall, blades of every size raining down and clattering to the floor. The Wanderer dashed forward instantly, the chainsaw screaming as he brought it down on the butcher's shoulder, cutting diagonally as his head lolled. The jagged teeth ate greedily, buzzing through flesh and bone until it tasted intestines. The Wanderer stared into the burlap sack, which frothed red through the fabric. The butcher parted down the middle, peeling apart in a spray that coated the entire room. The engine gorged on the fluid, chugging along as the plume of smoke exhaled like a freight train. The Wanderer's hands jolted as the saw jammed, sputtering to a stop as the teeth bit into the butcher's pelvis. Flayed almost in two, the hulking butcher went limp, his head resting against the broken wall. The Wanderer wheezed behind the mask, each breath heaving through bubbling blood as he admired his work and the devastation caused by his oil-burning companion. Relishing in his victory, he placed a boot on his enemy's chest and started to pull the blade free. An explosion of energy erupted from the butcher's body, and a burst of hot air hit the Wanderer like a wall. The limp butcher's hands sprang to life, one grabbing the Wanderer by the hair, while the other drove a meat hook under his chin. The hook punctured until it stuck into the inside of the metal mask, and his vision suddenly clouded and felt the tight wrap of a chain around his neck. With an angry pull of a chain, the Wanderer was lifted off the ground and kicking his feet as each consecutive pull brought him closer to the ceiling. The Wanderer caught glimpses of the scene before him in dizzy passes, his dead weight spinning as he dangled helplessly. The butcher stood awkwardly, his separated body pulsing as it freed the chainsaw from his midsection. The power tool fell amongst the other weapons, and as the Wanderer tried and failed to free himself, the butcher gathered around another chain from the floor. He looped it around his body several times and pulled it tight, groaning painfully as his body rejoined itself. Every breath from behind the blood-stained sack came in a cloud of steam, and the aura of power emanating from him was deafening. In his blind desperation, the Wanderer felt for the chainsaw, an invisible tether reaching for the tool as the butcher tied a loose knot in the chains. He rigged it in place with a metal spike, and the coil of links stretched taut against his bleeding mass. The Wanderer called for the chainsaw again, and as he contorted his fingers, the saw started to shake. The butcher reached up and felt for his head, seething with anger as he worked to reset his broken neck. The chainsaw skittered across the floor and bounced toward the Wanderer's outstretched hand. Hanging helplessly, he pulled on the ripcord until it sputtered to life and held it up to saw at the chains constricting him. The butcher rolled his adjusted neck, tendons and vertebrae impossibly recovering from his previous annihilation. He worked his shoulders against the chains and tested his movements as sparks showered the Wanderer, a guttural roar radiating from his lips. Just as the saw was almost through the chain, the butcher bounded after him, each step angrier than the last. The chain snapped and the Wanderer fell free, just as the butcher slammed into him. The saw buried into the butcher's face as he tackled him into the wall. Together, they punched through the wall of the basement and into the earth behind it. In a rush of flailing limbs, they burst through the side of the quarry, exchanging blows as they tumbled over layers of steep rock. The gloomy wind tossed at their clothes and blood painted the air, each punch and chainsaw slash sending a spatter to a growing avalanche. The butcher threw jabs and hooks with every topple, and the chainsaw nicked at his chains and scored his flesh. Even with the hook still stuck in his jaw, the Wanderer fought back ruthlessly, rending in weak spots until the momentum was too much to work the saw. The butcher wrapped both hands around his throat, shoving the meat hook further as the Wanderer dug a thumb into his eye. Like a boulder rolling down a mountain, they bounced in unison down the multiple cliffs of rock. Each impact tried to force them apart, but their death roll resumed each time they hit air. The world blurred around them in a barrage of kicks, punches, and knees, and just as it felt like they would fall forever, a sudden stop came in the form of mud and standing water. The splash was tremendous. Disfigured creatures scurried away from the pit in fear of the screaming saw. The butcher was up in an instant, mounting the submersed Wanderer and pummeling with such rage, he didn't stop even as the chainsaw bit into his stomach. The blade spun furiously, spraying a bloody geyser at his back as he held his enemy underwater. Through a murky film, the Wanderer watched him rain down punches, driving his head further into the sucking mud as he held onto the saw for dear life. Turning entrails to mush, the chainsaw kept working until there was nothing left to eat. Chains split and bones shaved away, but still the butcher pummeled away. With a defeated sputter, the chainsaw succumbed to lack of fuel, coming to a silent halt in the ruined torso. The Wanderer battered and clawed at his attacker, his fingers coming back wet with strips of gore and burlap. He punctured eyes and dug into open wounds, but nothing would stop the punishment from the butcher. Water filled his lungs and the world started to fade, and the Wanderer felt for any attempt to gain ground. The chained vessel simply would not stop, even as knuckles broke against the mask and fingernails came free. And just when the Wanderer felt himself slipping away, he felt the meat hook in his jaw. The hook came free in a rip of flesh, and the Wanderer shoved it upward as hard as he could. As the hook pierced through the butcher's eye socket, he felt a brief pause in the brutal beating. And a second was all it took. In the flash of an eye, the Wanderer wormed out from underneath the crushing weight of the butcher and wrapped the hook's chain around his neck, just as he did moments ago. He pulled the chain taut and hurtled over the confused butcher, pulling the chain hard with both hands. He tried to fight it, but the hook ripped violently, making his body obey with every tug. The Wanderer stopped him and planted a heavy boot on his back, and put his whole body into a final, devastating pull. The chain worked as both a noose and a guillotine, and with a loud rip, the butcher's head came free from his body, bringing his spine along with it. Alas, the butcher fell silent. The Wanderer stood victorious, letting the beheading chain fall with a splash. Thunder rumbled in the sky, and a crackle of lightning forked across it. With heavy, wheezing breaths, the Wanderer looked above, just as the patter of rain started to hit the metal mask. He let out a battle cry as the rush faded, and in the smear of muddy water, it almost looked as if the face was trying to move. Slow and exhausted, the chainsaw man rolled the headless corpse over and grabbed the saw. The handle was hot to the touch, and it came free with a squelch. In the shadows of the pit, a wicked creature watched with frightened interest. A man that walked on his hands and pulled a trail of twisted entrails behind it. He watched the masked man from a distance, his upside-down face observing with long ago gouged-out eyes. The viscera merman shuddered as the masked man unscrewed the fuel cap of the chainsaw and tilted back his metal face, right before vomiting violently into the reservoir. The burning scent of gasoline carried on the wind, and with a few pulls of the ripcord, the chainsaw came to life. Once more, without as much as a word, the Wanderer left his adversary behind, sauntering through the mud almost like he was disappointed. Above the pit, the merman watched as the butcher's house started to fade away, dissolving like sand in a box. Shingles, siding, and boards fluttered away like ashen butterflies on the wind. When the merman looked back at the Wanderer, he was gone, as if nothing ever happened. Hey everybody, Nightmares Nightly here. I'd like to thank all of you for listening to the video. This was written by A Hawaiian Shirt, aka Jesse Pullins. If you like this story, he has a playlist on the channel with more of his work. And he's also a published author. You can check out his books here on Amazon. I highly suggest giving them a read. I got this one off of Aggravated Flesh, another flash fiction. This was the last story in the book, and it's one of my favorites. If you'd like to support him, check out his work on Amazon in the links below. And, as always, thanks for listening, everybody. The Wandering Saw. The wind whispered across the infinite plain like a great black hand, casting waves of shadows over the dancing grass. Each individual blade curved under the whirling gust, almost as if it cowered under the silent chorus of tortured screams it seemed to bring with it. Each breeze was filled with an acute sense of pain, a wail of eternal anguish inaudible to the normal human ear. The grass swayed back and forth before abruptly standing straight, pulsating in response to the arrival of a wanderer in the sea of gloom. The endless grass could sense the danger, the violence, oozing from the very pores of the man who trudged through the valley. Under his step, the blades bent beneath his oppressiveness, flattening under his boot without really knowing why. The man planted his rubber boots firmly into the grass, crushing the frightened blades as he scoured the horizon of the eternal gray. The wind whipped at his long, matted hair, almost dread-like from a lifetime of blood and grime caking the strands without as much as a single wash. His face was obscured by a crude metal mask. An emotionless expression shone on the rusted iron. He was heavy-set, but carried it in a way that made it powerful. What was once a white cotton shirt was heavily stained with dirt and a faded crimson color, with a black leather apron tied around his waist and neck. Both hands wore long butcher's gloves, one squeezed in a fist, the other gripping a sticky chainsaw. He moved his head across the dark grassland lazily, as if he hadn't seen anything interesting in days. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. His only regime was the endless wander, and to find someone worthy of tasting the jagged teeth of his saw. The grass around his boots vibrates intensely, almost as if they were shaking in fear. Without direction or any inclination of where to go, he simply walked forward, the chainsaw swaying in his low grip. When the teeth grazed a taller blade among the rest, the foliage seemed to silently scream, withering away like ash in a windstorm. On he trudged, one heavy booted step after another. It was a determined walk, each step filled with unspoken purpose, silently drawing closer and closer to a blind goal that made sense only to him. The chainsaw was heavy in his left hand, but he held on, impatiently waiting for the exulting pull of the ripcord. Despite the nagging desire, it remained calm, like an itching gunslinger's hand eagerly waiting to draw the machined blade. Creatures lurked in the shadows of the tall grass, watching the wanderer in frightened silence. Not a single organism looked identical to the next, aside from the recurring theme of twisted gore and limb amalgamation. Occasionally, the masked man would stop and slowly browse the horizon, and the things lurking would duck out of sight, and trembling under the metal gaze. He would look only for a few seconds, but the concept of time was lost to this plane. The single blink of an eye could take an eternity to observe. And to the hidden pests in the grass, all they could do was wait for the roar of the living chainsaw. But there was no cord pulled, no hostility brewing. The masked wanderer simply turned back to his course and continued his slow march, leaving the critters be. Concern was not a capable feeling for the wanderer, nor was any of the normal human feelings one would experience. Deep within the expressionless face of the rusted mask was the ability to sense the power of those around him, as if he could see an aura of strength radiating from the creatures he passed. If something were to lurch from the grass and attack him, he would know, and he would reach for the cord in the same instant his opponent took a single step in his direction. Over many hills and slopes walked the Chainsaw Man, with nothing but more grass and the weak hiding around him. He could sense them trembling, but he paid them no mind. They were not worthy of tasting the teeth. Step after step he continued on, pressing forward through the trembling grass with steady, monotonous steps. The more he walked, the more he felt the itch, the urge to rip the chainsaw to life and let it scream. The want of the vibration in his fist was what he existed for, but it was pointless if there was no one worthy of feeling its shredding embrace. As the masked wanderer reached the top of a hill, it gave him eyes on the plain ahead, one of the twisted metal and stacked husks, a junkyard. The Chainsaw Man looked over the newfound area with calm excitement, wondering if such an opponent was hiding among the nooks of scrap. He cracked his stiff neck, feeling the wear of constant travel in his demented bones. He wasn't tired, and there would be no rest. The wind of the next fight was enough to keep him going, and it was more nourishing than any morsel of food or relished depravity he could indulge in. Without further delay, he descended the hill and trudged into the walls of scrapped automobiles, seeking the reward that lay within. The destroyed vehicle frames were stacked well over his head, looming over like skyscrapers of burnt metal. The vibrating grass thinned and eventually gave way to a slop of mud, each step sucking at his rubber boots as the journey grew more difficult. The weaker pests watched from their posts in the distorted steel, watching him work his way through the walls of scrap. Off in the distance, a scuffed-up jester with bleeding eyes watched from atop the wreckage, a bloody skinning knife squeezed into his linen glove. The wanderer could sense his gaze, but didn't give him as much as a glance. He was not the opponent he sought. With his sense of power, he felt the jester slip away into the surrounding abyss, withering away until the aura was lost. Deeper and deeper, the masked man descended into the walls of skeletal automobiles, each passing row growing narrower until he found himself in some sort of hallway of broken steel. He was getting closer. Every step planted brought him closer to his reward. The chainsaw was ready, begging to come to life. He idly ignored the plea, his boots slapping through the mud that came up to his ankles. An aroma of stale petrol wafted down the tunnel of stacked cars. The fuming scent welcomed the congested nostrils behind the mask. Ahead there was a standing pool of gasoline, its oily shine reflecting on the mud surface. With a silent nod of acceptance, the masked man trudged his way towards the collection of fuel. Without a sound, the man knelt before it, the swampy ground soaking his pant leg. He tilted his mask upward, long locks of dirty hair obscuring his face. As his chapped lips kissed the surface of the potent liquid, he slurped loudly, taking in mouthful after mouthful of the burning water. He drank greedily, for it was perhaps the only other indulgence he allowed, aside from the wandering hunt. The fluid stung his cheeks, and with every gulp he felt the fire shriveling his insides. Behind him there was a thud, followed by the clang of metal. He paused his quenching thirst and slowly slid the mask down, swallowing the last bit of gasoline that continued to stab at his rotting gullet. With the sound of wrung leather, he squeezed the hilt of the chainsaw as he returned to his feet. He could hear the hissing of his visitor lurking behind him, but he did not quicken his pace. He turned to see half a man, hunched low like a wolf ready to strike. The man was perched on his hands, holding himself upright with bent arms. The walking torso took a hand step forward, dragging his body that was obliterated from the waist down. He had a mess of tentacle-like intestines where his legs would be, and he slid himself over the mud-slick surface like some sort of grotesque octopus merman. His face was upside down, and a toothy mouth served as one hollow eyeball. His actual legs looked as if they had been gouged out ages ago. The butchered merman looked over the wanderer with his sniffing nostril, trying to size him up without actually seeing him. After a series of reverse smells, the merman shrieked, his coarse growl bouncing off the walls of cars that sounded like a chorus of tortured men. After his lungs emptied, he puffed his muddy chest out, letting his growl of intimidation sink in. The wind whistled as the chainsaw man looked down on the merman, his dreads whipping wildly. He stared intently from behind the rusted mask, the closed eyes on the iron burrowing into the walking torso. He took a powerful step forward, his boots striking the mud so hard it seemed to shake the ground. The air around them seemed to crackle, and suddenly the merman wailed in fear, like lightning had struck inches from his face. In a series of screeches, the torso fled, burrowing into the wreckage with its flailing guts trailing behind him. The masked man watched until the pest was out of sight, and when he was satisfied with the dismissal, he continued his journey down the iron corridor. The air grew thicker the closer he got. He could feel the growing intensity with every step, and as the metallic taste of victory was in reach, he felt the ever-evolving itch of the ripcord demanding attention. He silenced the need and focused only on the whistling wind as he waded through the energized atmosphere. His breath wheezed against the mask, his boots sloshed in the mud, the apron slapped in the gust, and as he drew toward the end of the corridor, he heard the first sounds of his opponent's presence. The tearing came first. It was a loud, shrewd hiss like someone was ripping carpet from an old floor. It was slow, painfully drug out. Whoever was causing such a commotion was taking their time, enjoying every step of their cruel endeavor. Each tear was followed by a muffled groan, like magma suffocating under a hard shell. The masked man drifted in, eager to see the scene of his next battleground. So close to the reward, he couldn't pass up savoring the discovery. There was a loud pop, accompanied by a grunt of relief. The chainsaw man could hear the sudden gush of fluid peppering the mud, a shower of blood without question. It was a familiar sound, one common in a land such as this. Then there was the sound of a thrown object slapping on the wet ground. The next grunt was slower, almost aroused. Whatever task had been completed had just as easily been forgotten. Unable to wait any longer, the masked man reached the end of the metal hallway, arriving in a round, dead-end clearing. It was a miniature coliseum, and the junk cars were stacked much higher. The walls of scrap reached almost 30 feet, and towering high to keep out any unwanted attention. Only a few brave crows watched from the pinnacle, blood-red eyes waiting for the inevitable feast. The masked man watched silently, the source of the noise being everything he wanted it to be. Alas, the long journey had paid off. He had come to the right place. Directly in the center of the clearing was a chiseled mountain of a man, his muscles flexing as he worked on his prey beneath him. Beads of sweat trickled down his brow as he twisted the giant spiral gear of a two-handed crescent wrench. He adjusted the mechanical jaw on the oversized tool, his beady eyes never leaving his victim. A faded yellow hard hat was strapped to his head, a color that matched his reflecting fireman trousers. He was shirtless, showing his natural armor of bulging muscle and suspenders that stretched over a broad chest. With the sound of gnashing molars, he worked his jaw, a complete lack of skin and tendons from his cheeks down, showing the complete lower half of his skull. The hulking worker was so entranced on his prey, he hadn't yet noticed the masked man observing in silence. Beneath the weight of the muscular fiend was a body, so horribly mangled the only features telling its gender were the pair of pale breasts pressed into the mud. Both legs had been wrenched off mid-thigh, as well as the right arm. Each stump was a torn mess of broken bone and warped gristle. The only limb intact was the left arm, frozen in a final reach of despair, contorted fingers grasping at the unknown possibility of rescue. The masked man watched as the helmeted fiend lowered the cold forged steel jaw on the last limb, spinning the gear to get the perfect clamped bite on the tender flesh. The laborer's bony jaw clacked with excitement when he stood and gripped the wrench in both hands, giving view to the outline of a large erection in the tight fireman pants. Just as the fiend was about to throw his man-made lever, he stopped, suddenly transfixed on the face of the mutilated female. With one hand holding the wrench, he crouched, his clicking jaw inches from the girl's face. His free hand caressed her matted hair, moving the strands from her brow so he could see the side of her face that wasn't buried in mud. Her cheek wore the streams of 100 dried tears beneath a single bloodshot eye that was locked in the distance. Through twitching eyelids, she stared at the masked man, who watched in silence, savoring. As the beady eyes found the rusted mask, a ghostly scream erupted from the skeletal jaw, so loud it shattered every window in the makeshift coliseum. In a rain of glass, the laborer rose, tearing the wrench from the ground and letting the heavier end fall into his palm. With a single stride, he stepped in front of his prey, as if to block the path of the chainsaw-wielding trespasser. There were no words spoken, only the invisible rules of the fight that would now have to unfold. The laborer flexed his entire upper body, veins popping like straw all across. The masked man reached for the cord, his wrists and fingers cracked from prolonged disuse. When his digits curled around the cord's T-handle, he felt his whole body come to life, suddenly reawakened from a long-lost slumber. He waited for the opponent to make the first move, and as the helmeted fiend took his first sprinting stride, he yanked hard on the rope. The chainsaw roared to life, and the battle began, the jagged teeth moving in a blur as they cut through the air. The laborer jumped and brought the wrench down hard, aiming for the metal mask in his aggressive rage. Another ghastly scream exploded from his bony jaw as the tool crashed into the ground, throwing chunks of broken earth and splashes of mud in all directions. The wanderer had moved out of the way at the last second and was thrashing with the chainsaw, swinging wide at his opponent's face. The laborer tucked his chin and caught the screaming blade with his helmet, feeling the teeth dig into the tough plastic before it glanced off. The masked man worked with the momentum of the saw, holding it outstretched in both hands and pivoting his feet in the mud so he spun with the weight of the power tool. And turning on his heel, the masked man turned and brought the saw down harder this time. With a frustrated grunt, the laborer yanked the wrench free from the earth, bringing it up just in time to stop and absorb the saw's impact. The chainsaw burrowed into the wrench with a flurry of dancing sparks, the unnatural teeth shaving a divot into the steel. The masked man leaned into his attack, gripping the shaking blade like a heavy sword. The helmeted fiend buckled under the vibrating weight, his boots sliding in the mud as he fought for traction. He looked into the expressionless mask of his mysterious challenger, the wrench shaking so hard it tore the skin on his palms. Toxic black smoke billowed from the engine as he teetered into the cut, rocking back and forth like he was finishing a fallen tree. The mask shielded any signs of fatigue, only adding to the power of the maniacal blade. This angered the laborer deeply, and he flexed again to unleash his own power, fueled by the interrupted climax of his prey. The laborer deadlifted the weight with his massive legs and repelled the saw with a wild swing, rearing back to bring the wrench down on his opponent's skull once again. The masked man stepped in quickly, tossing his weight into a haymaker with his defense wide open, his gloved fist buried into the laborer's face, bony knuckles crushing his nose and digging into his left eye socket. The wound bled immediately, crimson tendrils seeping from half of his face the instant he withdrew the punch. The laborer echoed another ethereal scream, much louder than before. The mangled female on the ground burrowed her face away from the noise, and the crows perched above flew away in fright. The laborer clacked his jaw rapidly as his eyes glowed red, his veins pulsing like living worms across taut muscles. The next punch came before the wanderer had time to react, a straight-armed slug smashing into the mask like it was shot from a 75mm cannon. The impact jarred his neck and the shockwave sent his body reeling, hurtling across the mud like a skipping rock. The wanderer crashed into the Colosseum wall, embedded into the warped metal in a flurry of dust and debris. As the dust cleared, he shouldered a broken sedan door that tried to envelop him in an attempt to break free of the junk's embrace. The saw still throbbed with life, a feral cough of digested fuel surging through the machinery. The wanderer raised his head just in time to see the helmeted fiend rocketing toward him, already at half swing with the muddy wrench. With glowing evil eyes blinding his vision, he felt the excessive force of the wrench crushing his plump stomach, several ribs cracking under the colossal weight of the blow. The wall of trash cars shifted under the immense power of the attack, and the wanderer felt his body being pressed further into the broken steel. A meteor shower of metal and fiberglass rained down from the walls of their arena, dozens of sharp pieces sticking into the mud around them. Winded, the laborer reached a thick arm into the wreckage and grabbed the wanderer by the shoulder, ripping him from his twisted encasement. The masked man latched onto his opponent's arm and squeezed, digging his meaty thumb into the soft flesh opposing the elbow. With shattering strength, he broke the laborer's arm and twisted, feeling the sinewy snap of the joint under his butcher's glove. The helmeted fiend sucked in for a cry of pain, but was stopped short as the wanderer burst from the wreckage, driving mask first into a full-body headbutt. The blank mask drilled into the laborer's face like a battering ram, the rusted iron splintering the hard hat to several scattering pieces. Distraught from the surprise attack, the laborer stumbled, retaliating with an awkward one-handed swing of the wrench. In the staggered blink of his beady eye, the wanderer squeezed the injured arm and broke it backwards, followed by a chainsaw swing that swatted the wrench away like an annoying fly. As the laborer flinched from the wanderer's inhuman recovery, the masked man let go of the ruined limb and smashed him in the face with the pommel of his mechanical sword. The hardware broke multiple teeth from the skeletal jaw, and the laborer fell like a rag doll, inches from the bloodshot gaze of the tortured female. He locked one eye with the girl, his other one swelled shut from his opponent's haymaker. As he stared at her, he struggled to lift the wrench once more, pouring all of his strength into a final attempt to reclaim his domain. As he looked into the girl's mocking eye, he heard the scream of the chainsaw, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the masked wanderer. Despite his odds, he tried to lift the wrench again, only to feel the immeasurable pain of the teeth chewing through his flesh. As the wanderer sideswiped him, the wicked blade ate through the muscular arm with ease and dug into his ribcage, shredding meat and bone alike as if it didn't exist at all. The wrench fell to its murky grave, taking the severed arm with it. With nothing else to hold himself up, the laborer collapsed into the mud with a wet smack, just as immobile as the abandoned girl that lay beside him. The wanderer stood over him, wet locks dripping on the laborer's chest as the blank mask looked down on him. The power of his gaze was suffocating, and as the rusted mask stared from above, he felt just as much as the prey he hunted. The fight was over. The laborer had lost. Without a single word, the wanderer planted a rubber boot on his heaving chest. He held him firm, just enough to keep him in place for the final blow. The wanderer did not receive pleasure from cruelty, nor did he enjoy toying with those he defeated. He only did what was necessary to move on. He took a closing look at the laborer, and as he squeezed the chainsaw's trigger, the blade's edge screamed into motion. The laborer released a clacking hiss as the wanderer thrust the saw downward, plunging the weapon underneath the bony jaw. A gurgling rush gave way to the grinding of marrow, the hot chain kicking up a spray that splattered the black leather apron. The laborer's husk bucked under his planted boot, and he ran the blade upward, separating the skull in an explosion of broken bone and brain matter. The saw screamed until the rush of blood and gore gave way to the tilled mud, and only as the corpse ceased all movement did the chain stop its grind. The wanderer yanked the blade from the mess in silent satisfaction, pausing only momentarily to savor his victory. He looked up to the eternal overcast sky, blood running down the rusted iron that lacked all visible feeling. There was a deep breath. And as he exhaled, lightning cracked across the sky in a bright flash. Sheets of rain followed, showering the wreckage of the junkyard arena as if it tried to wash away the madness. Raindrops seeped past the mask and trickled down his shielded face in cool streams. There was an instant of solace, but it was only temporary. When he finally lowered his head, he knew it was time to move on. Rainwater trickled down the caked blade, leaving a red trail in the mud as he made his exit. A booming thunderclap sang across the sky as the wanderer left the destruction behind him, continuing his unending search for a stronger opponent.